Headlines and hot takes, they have their place. But at our podcast, ESPN Daily, we don't just skim the surface of sports. Dude, I mean, this clearly transcends blood feuds, rivalries, sports. This is something far, far deeper than that. I'm your host, Pablo Torre, and every day, we try to dive into the stories behind the athletes.
The picture of him in the dugout afterwards just looked like a guy who'd had his heart ripped out.
Listen to ESPN Daily wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, everyone. It is 4 o'clock in the East. I'm Alicia Menendez, in for Nicole Wallace. There is new urgency in the mission to evacuate Americans and allies from Afghanistan. Just a day after a devastating bombing by ISIS that killed 13 U.S. service members and more than 100 Afghan civilians, national security officials have reportedly told the president that another terror attack in Kabul is likely. The Pentagon today warning of, quote, specific, credible threats, while also clarifying that yesterday's attack involved a single suicide bomber and one or more gunmen at a gate to the Kabul airport, and that there was not a second explosion at the hotel nearby, as was originally reported. And with just a few days to go before U.S. forces leave, evacuation flights are still underway. More than 12,000 people were flown out in the last 24 hours. The State Department believes the number of Americans looking to leave Afghanistan now in the hundreds. But crowds are still gathering near Kabul airport, as seen here in satellite photos, not far from the site of yesterday's attack. The New York Times describing the scene this way, quote, at the airport and in the streets, the U.S. military and the Taliban tried to exert what authority they could. Militants with rifles kept crowds farther away from the airport's entrance gates, guarding checkpoints with trucks and at least one Humvee parked on the roads. The waiting crowds, many standing by buses with bags at their sides, numbered in the hundreds, not the thousands of previous days. The security situation turning the United States and the Taliban into strange bedfellows. Here's how Democratic Congressman Seth Moulton, who went on a controversial and unauthorized trip to Kabul earlier this week, described the scene before the bombing and how the Marines are working with the Taliban.
It's an impossible task we've given them to literally sift through a sea of humanity, thousands and thousands of Afghans, to try to pluck out our allies, our friends, and their families, their husbands, their wives, their little girls and boys, and put their kids on their back and hold their hands and literally pull them to freedom. So I expected to see a gate with Marines on one side and Afghans on the other, but that's not the way this can work. Because we waited so long to start this evacuation, we have to go out in the crowd. So these Marines were out there, feet from the Taliban with their horsewhips, at tremendous risk, literally saving lives. These Marines who grew up knowing that the Taliban harbored the people who attacked us on 9/11 were now asked to work with these terrorists. But we have to save lives. And one of the most important things we learned by being there on the ground is that crazy relationship with the Taliban is actually going to be really important going forward.
Politico is shedding light on that, quote, crazy relationship with the Taliban, reporting this, quote, U.S. officials in Kabul gave the Taliban a list of names of American citizens, green card holders, and Afghan allies to grant entry into the militant-controlled outer perimeter of the city's airport. A choice that's prompted outrage behind the scenes from lawmakers and military officials. Looming over all of this, President Biden's pledge to retaliate against ISIS and questions about what it will take for the U.S. to contain terror threats in the region. The New York Times reports American officials are reworking plans to counter threats that could emerge from Afghanistan's chaos, according to current and former officials, negotiating for new bases in Central Asian countries, determining how clandestine officers can run sources in the country without the military and diplomatic outposts that provided cover to spies for 2 decades, and figuring out from where the CIA could launch drone strikes and other Afghanistan operations. And that is where we begin. Joining us now, Jonathan Lemire, White House reporter for the Associated Press and an MSNBC contributor. Also with us, Greg Myrie, NPR national security correspondent, who's been covering Afghanistan since 1993. He was one of the first reporters to interview members of the Taliban. And Evelyn Farkas is back, a former official at the Defense Department, now an MSNBC contributor. Greg, I want to start with you. Officials believe another terror attack is likely. Are you getting any sense from officials that changes the nature of the mission?
Well, they're saying it hasn't. They're saying that they're still processing people. There were 5,000 people in the airport today. That's going to continue right up until the final moment. That's the intention. Now, I have not seen video or images from the perimeter and particularly the Abbey Gate, where the days leading up to the attack, you saw the Marines really wading out to the crowd, and just gut-wrenching to see those images, especially after we know what happened. So I'm not clear on how close the U.S. military is getting to the people that are still coming to the airport, but that processing is still going on. Flights are still taking off.
Yeah, Jonathan, the White House press briefing today gives the clear sense that the administration is focused on those evacuations. What are you hearing from your sources inside the administration?
Well, there's no doubt, Alicia, the senior officials that I've spoken to say there's that much more urgency now to move as quickly as possible in the light of the terrible terror attack yesterday and the warnings and threats that another one could happen again in the days ahead. That August 31st deadline looms. We've heard from the president. He wants to stick to it. He believes that they can get the Americans out by that date and most of our Afghan allies. Now, he's asked for contingency plans, so he said that if needed, that deadline could be extended a couple of days if required, but they'd really prefer not to. Again, especially in light of yesterday's attack, which just underscores the danger for any American, including American members of the American military who were there past the deadline. The Taliban, who are somewhat of our unlikely allies right now, trying to expedite the evacuations, they made clear they didn't want an extension. And certainly ISIS-K, this terror group, they're not going to adhere to any deadline either. And they've made that very clear. We saw from the president yesterday just how much this weighs on him, emotional at times in that speech, coming under withering criticism for the way this evacuation operation has been conducted. But we also heard a resolve to hunt down and get those who are responsible. And we heard from White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. She added to what he meant. She said, and I paraphrase, those people shouldn't be alive on this earth anymore. So that's certainly our stark warning from the president here. And she also was asked about the strange bedfellows with the Taliban. And she said, look, we have to be realistic. Sometimes we have to cooperate with those we don't really get along with.
Right. Evelyn, to that point, NBC News is reporting that the Taliban's head of security was designated as a terrorist by the U.S. government 10 years ago. There's a $5 million reward for information that could lead to his capture. Can you walk us through what the U.S.-Taliban relationship looks like right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds, Alicia, it is exactly as Jonathan sketched out. It's a relationship of convenience. Right now, they have something of control over Kabul and most of Afghanistan, although I say right now because that could change. And so the U.S. government is in a position to work with the people who have the most power and leverage on the ground, which is, unfortunately, the Taliban. We have really no choice. I will say, though, that they also don't control all the people who are notionally Taliban. And I heard another report earlier today that somewhere some Taliban official mentioned that they regretted releasing the prisoners when they got into Kabul and onto Bagram base, because, of course, many of those were kind of ISIS and al-Qaeda hardened fighters. I'm sure they're regretting it, and they will continue to regret it. And there will be some kind of small-scale, if not large-scale, civil war that continues to be waged in Afghanistan after we leave. But right now, the focus is on getting everyone out, of course.
Greg, I was struck by something that General McKenzie said yesterday of the Taliban, quote, "It's not what they say, it's what they do." How tenuous is this relationship?
Oh, it's absolutely very tenuous. The Taliban are effectively providing airport security. General McKenzie also said the Taliban is doing some checks that are pretty good, other checks not so good. We've seen reports where the Taliban were effectively harassing people. but they're having to make they're deciding who gets through and who doesn't. And the U.S. is trying to work with them. They're still in daily contact. There were questions about, did the Taliban maybe let this bomber come through? General McKenzie said he had no evidence to that effect. The Taliban do want the Americans out of there, but they also want a relationship with certainly Western countries. Looks like they want embassies to stay open, maybe even want the U.S. to keep its embassy open. The U.S. hasn't made a decision one way or another on that, but there is this weird symbiotic relationship. And from what we're seeing this week, it's obviously related to the withdrawal, but there's also a sense that they may have some relationship that will carry on after the last plane goes wheels up.
Evelyn, I worry that I cut you off a moment ago. So if there was a second part to that thought, I encourage you to include it. But I do, given the context that you have all just given us about this relationship, I want to return to the report about the U.S. providing a list of names to evacuate to the Taliban. This one, quote, stood out to me. Basically, they just put all those Afghans on a kill list, said one defense official, who, like others, spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss a sensitive topic. It's just appalling and shocking and makes you feel unclean. Evelyn, your sense of why they did this?
Well, I think that they felt like it was the only way they knew when they were negotiating to try to get people through. But I would agree that it was a really risky proposition. And I'm in touch with people, Afghans and others in Kabul right now, who are either trying to get out or trying to help others get out. And I know that there's now an effort underway to try to remove some names as they're getting people in. That we don't really want to give the Taliban all the information about the people that we're taking out, because there is no 100% trust. And certainly our military, our government officials, and the volunteers who are helping get people out don't trust the Taliban.
Greg, I want to read you a little bit more of the New York Times reporting on the CIA's mission after the deadline to withdraw. They write, Mr. Biden's determination to end the military's involvement in Afghanistan means that starting next month, any American presence in the country would most likely be part of clandestine operation that is not publicly acknowledged. The CIA's new mission will be narrower, a senior intelligence official said. It will no longer have to help protect thousands of troops and diplomats and will focus instead on hunting terrorist groups that can attack beyond Afghanistan's border. But the rapid American exit devastated the agency's networks, and spies will most likely have to rebuild them and manage sources from abroad, according to current and former officials. Greg, that sounds to me like a narrower mission, but in many ways a much harder mission.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the people I've been talking to have said exactly that. Their resources have already shrunk. In fact, William Burns, the CIA director, testified to that effect in Congress. The CIA depends very much on the military and the diplomats at the embassy. The military provides protection. The embassy gives them a place to work out of. The network of Afghans that they've had for 20 years, all those things have withered as we see the military leave, the diplomats leave, and many of those Afghans they worked with either have fled the country or are no longer in a position to help. So when the president talks about going after ISIS-K, the group that's been blamed for the bombing, the U.S. is going to be doing it with much more limited resources. And the president talks about doing it over the horizon, but that's a much, much more difficult challenge.
Jonathan, I want to play some sound for you from President Biden. This is the president earlier today talking about the mission in Afghanistan. Take a listen.
Let me begin by once again acknowledging the bravery and the sacrifice that our military makes every single day, and the loss of those Americans and Marines and sailor and Army personnel is tragic. So my heart goes out, our hearts go out to all those who we've lost. But look, the mission there being performed is dangerous, and is now it's come with a significant loss of American personnel. And but it's a worthy mission because they continue to evacuate folks out of that region, out of the airport. Evacuated more than 12,000 additional people out of the airport in the last 24 hours.
Jonathan, there are the evacuations. I was struck by the fact that in the Pentagon briefing, we've started to shift the conversation to talking about what resettlement for these refugees is going to look like. What are you hearing from the administration about what success is going to look like in the days and weeks ahead?
Well, let's first follow up what the president said and honor the sacrifice of those members of the armed forces, those Marines who have saved countless lives by their own work there and giving up their own lives to protect others. And I think, Alicia, it's a good question. And I think we have two parts here. First part is still, of course, paramount is getting people out. And it was striking that despite yesterday's terror attack, the evacuation flights are still continuing. There are thousands of people who were airlifted out yesterday, more today. That is going to continue up until that August 31st deadline, or just about before it, because there will need to, of course, give some time for the American military itself to get out personnel and equipment. The resettlement is another issue. It's become a hotly politicized one already. We've heard from a number of Republicans and conservative media figures really balking at the idea of giving these Afghans home in the United States, at least not without strict screening. The White House is saying, well, we're doing that. We're giving strict screening. They're heading to third-party countries first, some of whom will remain there or move on elsewhere, some of whom will come to the United States. And we have seen some already enter America at a few military bases across the country. So that is going to be a part of this. And I think that the president was blunt yesterday. He knows that the debt that the United States owes these Afghans, these translators, other civilians who helped us, those whose lives are now in jeopardy because of the threat by the Taliban. And he has said repeatedly, we will get out as many of them as we can. But he was clear, we wouldn't be able to get all of them out. He said that end of any war, not everyone is able to leave. And that is a stark, sobering reality that we're all, as a nation, going to have to face in the weeks ahead after the U.S. does pull out and the Taliban fully take over.
Evelyn, I am so struck by part of what I was reading earlier, the idea that even in the wake of the attack that we saw yesterday, still hundreds waiting outside that airport with their only possessions on them for the chance to get on one of those planes. Talk to me about the stakes of the next few days, the stakes of making sure that this goes as well as it can, the stakes of getting those people out.
Yeah, Alicia, I think what we're going to try to do is get as many people as possible out. Some people will be left behind. I'm really worried about Afghan families that I've been trying to help who are SIVs. They qualify and they've been accepted into other countries, not the U.S. And these are people who can't go out and stand at the airport because they will get slaughtered immediately with their families by the Taliban. So the people standing outside the airport, I don't know what kind of case they have. Some of them, oftentimes people will send family members forward to see what the situation is. We're going to just have to get as many people as possible out. But then the aftermath will be important. We'll have to put pressure on the Taliban to, do something to respect human rights. We don't expect that from them, but we're going to have to press for it. And of course, you mentioned refugees. We're going to have to work hard on resettling and providing for refugees because we already have a worldwide refugee crisis, and this will just add to it.
Absolutely. Jonathan Lemire, Greg Myrie, Evelyn Farkas, thank you all so much for starting us off. When we come back, the GOP in Texas has all but secured its far-reaching rewrite of the state's voting laws, a power grab, Democrats say, to disenfranchise thousands of potential voters of color. We're going to look at how people are fighting back. Plus, thousands of families will face eviction from their homes, risking even greater exposure to COVID as well after a late-night decision from the Supreme Court. Will Congress move to put another stop to what could be a devastating next few months for so many? And later in the show, the Capitol Police officer responsible for shooting and killing an insurrectionist while defending the halls of Congress on January 6th, speaking out for the first time. That must-see interview and more when Deadline White House continues after this.
Our world is facing some big challenges. Chuck Todd breaks them down. A deep dive into a new topic.
Instead of covering all the big stories, we're going to cover one single subject impacting American politics.
Exploring and explaining the critical issues that affect our future. Meet the Press Reports. All episodes of Season 2 are now available on demand on Peacock.
Hey, it's Chris Hayes. This week on my podcast, Why Is This Happening? I'll be talking with the legendary Grammy Award-winning musician, Ani DeFranco.
Even when you're not in your zone, when you're struggling with something, but if you're totally open, if you accept that struggle, Like if you can show it and you can include the audience in what you're struggling against and your own process of when I'm on stage and it's pouring rain and the wind is whipping, my hair is down my throat and the sound is terrible and I'm being electrocuted. If I'm just in that thing and sharing it fully with the audience, they could get off on even that.
That's This Week on Why Is This Happening? Search for Why Is This Happening wherever you're listening right now and subscribe.
It's one thing to understand it conceptually, that it was perhaps a matter of time, but to actually see it, to watch it happen as Republicans in the Texas House this afternoon gave final passage 80-41 to their contentious voter restriction bill, well, that is something else entirely. From here, that bill goes back to the Senate and creeps closer to Governor Greg Abbott's desk. In broad strokes, here is what the bill does. It bans early drive-through and overnight voting, restricts vote by mail, adds new requirements on people who assist voters. It imposes criminal penalties on election workers and gives more power to partisan poll watchers. Wow. The sheer gravity of what this bill is capable of in terms of restricting voter rights means the clock is ticking. Advocates insist with urgency that it is time for federal legislation. Joining us now, Reverend Al Sharpton, host of MSNBC Politics Nation and president of the National Action Network, and Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, assistant dean for civic engagement at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, and an MSNBC contributor. Reverend Al, you have been one of those people calling for federal legislation for a while now, and as part of that crusade, you have got a big event tomorrow. Tell us about it.
Well, tomorrow morning, Martin Luther King III and his wife and those with the Drum Major Institute, along with National Action Network and myself and thousands of others, will march in the morning from McPherson Park to the Capitol, to the National Mall, right out in front of the Capitol, and have a huge rally. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus, leaders of major labor and civil rights organizations, and thousands will rally, calling on the Senate to pass the John Lewis Voter Act. It passed the House this week. It needs to pass the Senate. The reason why is federal legislation can override or supersede state legislation like Texas just did. This is the reason that they did the Voting Rights Act in the first place in 1965. If we go state by state, they can set the rules, as they've done now in Georgia and Florida, now Texas, and they're moving around the country. We need federal law to say that states cannot come with laws that discriminate. All of these laws disproportionately infringe upon the voting rights and voter accessibility of blacks and browns. And we want to see this law passed. The John Lewis Act will do that. And that's why we're marching here in Washington tomorrow.
So, Vicki, let's talk about what we're seeing out of Texas. According to July data from the Brennan Center, 18 states have already enacted 30 laws this year that will make it harder for Americans to vote. Now, Texas poised to add another big one to that list. So, federal legislation aside, what are some of the immediate consequences of bills like the one advanced in your state last night? What are you concerned with? What are you keeping your eye on?
I'm keeping my eye on the suppressive effect, Alicia. We know that our communities of color already have lower rates of participation. And then with these bills that we see, they're not only adding barriers for the general population, we know that the intent was very targeted. Surprise, surprise, one of the targets in the Texas bill was drive-through voting and overnight voting. This wasn't something that we saw across the state of Texas. This happened to be concentrated in Harris County, which is where Houston is located and where we have one of our largest concentrations of populations of color. So you start to see these targeted intents. And then we have this bill, the inevitability that you highlighted earlier, Alicia, it's going to ultimately go through conference committee and be signed into law. But then let's layer on top of that the redistricting or gerrymandering, if we want to put it differently, that's going to happen in just a couple of weeks here in Texas and in states across the nation that use partisan redistricting for their redrawing of the maps. And that's another layer that's going to further inhibit the voting of our populations of color.
You know, Reverend, conversations about voting rights have always been associated with systemic oppression, racism. I want to read you this write-up on what happened in Texas yesterday. The floor fight over GOP efforts to rewrite voting laws in the state quickly turned heated Thursday afternoon after Republican House Speaker asked members not to use the word racism while debating a bill Democrats have said will make it harder for people of color to vote. And then this is what he said, Rev. We can talk about racial impacts of this legislation without accusing members of this body of being racist. I don't know, Rev. That sounds a little defensive to me.
It sounds not only defensive, it sounds like they're trying to do the practice of racism without calling it racist. If you, in your own statement, say that it may have a disproportionate impact based on race, then how do you define racism other than to say it is going to have an impact unequally on race? It's not like he's coming up with saying, well, this is how we solve this, or this is how this is untrue. He's conceding it, but saying, don't call us that. And I think that if you study voting rights and civil rights history, they always said that. Oh, no, it's not racist. We just asked blacks how many jelly beans are in a jar. We just asked Latinos something that will offend their whole heritage. And clearly this is those that have come in the children of those that fought voting rights in the first place and coming with a whole new way of dealing with a racist way of trying to exploit the state laws to prohibit blacks and browns from having equal access to voting.
Vicki, let's talk about what to expect from federal legislation. The Democrat-controlled U.S. House passed the John Lewis voting rights bill this week. Now it's on its way to the Senate. It faces a very tough fight, to say the least. But there's this from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Democratic U.S. Senators Tammy Baldwin, Amy Klobuchar said Wednesday they were optimistic they could get Republicans to support voting rights legislation or persuade their Democratic colleagues to pass a measure strictly on party lines. I'm feeling good about the direction we're headed in now, said Klobuchar, the chairwoman of the Senate Rules Committee and a top negotiator on the voting legislation. Of note, I thought this was interesting. Baldwin says she sees signs Manchin could agree to filibuster changes, which feels like the thing we've been talking about for the past 6 months. So, Vicki, we're just talking about Texas. You remember how tough Democrats in the legislature there fought? The bill seems to be poised to pass anyway. Do you share Senators Baldwin and Klobuchar's optimism about this federal legislation?
I'm going to grab onto that optimism as well, Alicia. I am, because, we knew that the line in the stand was HR1, that Manchin and, other Republicans, that was a non-starter. But there's always been this discussion about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is the middle ground that we can come together on. Manchin has come forward. He laid out a framework. So there's not the opposition from him. The question is getting friends. How can you get 10 Republican friends over to support the John Lewis Voting Rights Act? I'm going to be optimistic here. I mean, I think that if this discussion is bubbling up and you have that support from the moderate Democrats, then it is not a lost cause. It is going to be an uphill battle, but I think it is one that we need to hold on to and keep the pressure on in events such as what the Rev is hosting and the work of grassroots organizations from across the country.
So let's go back to the event that you're hosting this weekend, Reverend Sharp. I mean, what is the message that you hope to broadcast that would reach some of those Republicans that we saw Senators Klobuchar, Baldwin, Victoria DeFrancesco Soto saying they have an ounce of optimism, can be persuaded?
I would say to them that if Republicans, even in the 60s, could go for the Voting Rights Act of 65, and then every decade since, all the way to 2013 with the Supreme Court decision, then why are you trying to go back pre-1965? Secondly, I'd say if you could carve out to go around the filibuster, around 60 votes, to confirm Supreme Court justices, why wouldn't we carve out around the 60 votes for something as fundamental and basic to a democracy like voting? Voting ought to be a carve-out, even if you keep the Senate rules the way they are. That's our message. It is very focused. We're here for that purpose, that we want to carve out to protect voting rights in this country, so that every state that has a history of this would have to pre-clear any moves with the Justice Department, and they would weigh it to make sure that it does not have disproportionate impact on people based on their race or based on their gender.
That preclearance piece is such a big piece of this conversation. Reverend Al Sharpton, we will all be watching this weekend. Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, thank you, as always, my friend, for spending some time with me. And be sure to tune in to a special edition of Politics Nation. This on Sunday, 5 p.m. Reverend Al will be celebrating the show's 10-year anniversary right here on MSNBC. Up next, the 6 conservative Supreme Court justices threw out Biden's pandemic eviction moratorium, which could set off a wave of people forced out onto the street. Questions again coming up about whether there should be changes to the high court. Stay with us. The Supreme Court has blocked the Biden administration's eviction moratorium, putting hundreds of thousands of people at risk of losing their homes in the midst of a still surging pandemic. The unsigned order, which was posted late last night, was opposed by all 3 liberal justices. There were no oral arguments for the case and no full briefings, which Justice Stephen Breyer slammed, writing in the dissenting opinion, quote, "These questions call for considered decision-making informed by full briefing and argument. Their answers impact the health of millions. We should not set aside the CDC's eviction moratorium in this summary proceeding." Let's bring in Melissa Murray, former law clerk to Justice Sonia Sotomayor, now an NYU law professor and MSNBC legal analyst. All right, as someone who's been in the room, Melissa, help us understand how this went down and why how it went down matters.
So this was a decision from what's known as the shadow docket. And these are the emergency appeals that the court takes up on an expedited basis. And again, without full briefing or even oral argument in these cases. So as Justice Breyer suggested, this is a case where we didn't have sort of full ventilation of both sides because it's happening in a very expedited, rushed fashion because of the emergency nature of this. So that's one of the things that we've been talking about a lot over the last couple of years. The Supreme Court has been more and more active in terms of deciding things on the shadow docket, which means there's a lot less transparency, a lot less briefing, and a lot less opportunity for the public to actually see the work of the court when they make decisions that are going to be decided in this cursory summary fashion.
And I do want to ask you a few questions about the nature of this court as it is emerging. But first, I want to ask you a question about this specific ruling, because the order stated that it is indisputable that the public has a strong interest in combating the spread of the COVID-19 Delta variant. But our system does not permit agencies to act unlawfully, even in pursuit of desirable ends. Melissa, is that your understanding of the legal precedent here?
Well, I'd say this is the understanding that this particular court has taken in the last couple of years. This is a court that has evinced a real hostility to the prospect of the administrative state and administrative agencies. They would prefer to see these kinds of actions that we typically see agencies like the CDC or the EBA taking being done by Congress itself. And so here the complaint was that the CDC issued this moratorium when, according to the court, what really should have happened is that Congress should have stepped in.
I want to remind everyone about what is at stake here and the people whose lives are running up both against some policy holes and this decision. People at risk of eviction, they were speaking about the hardship they were facing, what the Biden administration's extension meant to them. I want us to take a listen.
It's stressful, very stressful. I don't know what's going to happen from within the next week for me.
When you're going out looking for a job, and you don't know when you come home at 5 p.m. if you're going to be locked out your apartment or not. People need help. People are struggling right now.
To have the stress of not knowing if I could have a home when help is available and not being utilized, that's really heartbreaking. And it really says a lot to the state of Florida and how we're responding to this pandemic.
Shelters that, again, have already been traditionally under-resourced, especially in the state of Florida, overcrowded, are now looking at really, really kind of serious impact.
What you're seeing right now is moms and families with children who could be evicted in the next few days when there's money that is sitting in the hands of our local governments to pay their rent.
Melissa, speaking to the court piece of this specifically, when you step back and you look at the decisions we've seen this week, whether it is on the controversial Remain in Mexico program, whether it is on the eviction moratorium, what is the picture that starts to come into focus of what this current court is going to look like?
I mean, we already know what this current court is going to look like. We've known that for at least the last year. This is a much more conservative body than what we had even 2 years ago when it was a 5-4 conservative court. Now it is a 6-3 conservative supermajority. And we've seen just over this last term with the newest justice, Amy Coney Barrett, the court really has moved more toward the right in some of its rulings. This is one of them, the hostility toward the administrative state, the fact that we are in the middle of a global pandemic and the court is essentially second guessing the science and the data that administrative agencies charged with public health are using to make their decisions. I mean, this is all part and parcel of what we've seen.
Which is why this conversation about Justice Breyer's potential retirement comes into even sharper focus. Breyer said this in a recent interview. He said he is struggling to decide when to retire from the Supreme Court and is taking account of a host of factors, including who will name his successor. There are many things that go into a retirement decision, he said. He recalled approvingly something Justice Antonin Scalia had told him. He said, I don't want somebody appointed who will just reverse everything I've done for the last 25 years, he said during a wide-ranging interview on Thursday. That will inevitably be in the psychology of his decision, he said. I mean, how could it not be in the psychology of his decision, Melissa? And I am not going to ask you to play armchair psychologist. So instead, lay out for us what is at stake around Breyer's decision.
Well, let me just first say that in his jurisprudence, Justice Breyer has always been a fan of multi-factor tests, and it's not surprising that his approach to retirement would also employ a multi-factor test. So that's very much on brand. But he is someone who has been very clear that he's deeply, deeply worried about the polarization of politics and the way that that has infiltrated the Supreme Court. He does not want the search for his replacement to be one that is mired in partisan politics. But that horse may already be out of the barn. I mean, it's already really clear what the stakes are. It's not clear that the president will have the control of the Senate going forward after the midterm elections. And it's really go time for Justice Breyer. And I think that's why there's been so much pressure and so much attention paid to this particular potential vacancy.
All right, Melissa Murray, thank you as always. Coming up, a major defeat for Florida's governor and a win for parents and students who simply don't want to get sick. Stay with us.
Looking for more Dateline mysteries? Peacock's on the case with a new streaming channel, Dateline 24/7. With current season episodes and top picks from the archives, Dateline 24/7 is all Dateline all the time. Plus, with Peacock's Dateline collections, you can easily find top episodes in themes like love triangles, greed, and more.
To get started, go to peacocktv.com and sign up for free.
Breaking news today, a story we have been following for the past few weeks. A Florida judge ruling that Governor Ron DeSantis' order banning mask mandates in schools is unconstitutional, saying that local school boards have the right to set their own policies, like mask requirements. This is a major defeat for the governor, who has insisted only parents could decide whether their children wear masks. This ruling coming as the state of Florida is making yet another grim milestone, yesterday alone reporting over 900 deaths, the state's largest single-day increase since the pandemic began. Nationwide, the picture isn't looking great either. More than 100,000 COVID patients are hospitalized right now. That is the highest number since January, before vaccines were widely available to the public. Joining us now, MSNBC medical contributor Dr. Nahid Bhadelia, an infectious diseases physician and the founding director of the Boston University Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases Policy and Research. Dr. Bhadelia, more than half of Florida's students now go to schools mandating masks, but these fights against masks, how are they affecting the COVID rates that Florida is seeing right now?
Well, I think, Lisa, I'm going to start by the study that CDC just released today. There was a case cluster of a teacher who was not vaccinated, who was intermittently putting the mask on and taking it off when they were reading in the classroom. And in that setting, half of their students ended up becoming positive when the teacher was positive. That's how contagious and transmissible this Delta variant is. And I'll quote my good friend, Dr. Ashish Jha, who tweeted today that we can send students to the classroom potentially, but we can't just wing it. This is hard work, particularly in the setting of the transmissible variant. You really have to not just do those masking, which is really the basic, but really ventilate those buildings, mandate vaccines in those teachers, as many states have done, and really try to bring the rates of vaccinations up in all the older students who are going to be sharing the same space, and require testing. I mean, we have to do the hard work. And if we don't, you're going to see more examples, as you have in many of these states where they have opened the schools and then have had to send the students back in large clusters, and examples such as this study that CDC released today.
Dr. Bedelia, I want to read you this from the Washington Post, and the headline kind of says it all. As Florida faces record COVID-19 deaths, DeSantis says Biden should follow his lead. The piece goes on, he said he was going to end COVID. He hasn't done that, DeSantis told Fox News host Jesse Waters. And at the end of the day, he is trying to find a way to distract from the failures of his presidency. DeSantis' comments come at a time when the governor is continuing to resist coronavirus restrictions as the state's hospitals are overwhelmed during what one Florida doctor recently described as a crisis of unprecedented proportions. I mean, Dr. Bedelia, the delusion there is apparent, but also a complete lack of appreciation for how bans on mask mandates or misinformation on vaccines prohibits any administration from ending COVID, much less the fact that in his own state, some morgues are at capacity.
I'm trying to figure out what part of Florida's response Governor DeSantis thinks is a success, given that they're seeing more cases now. Their wave is at least as bad as it was in the winter, if not higher at this point. And you're seeing the same impact on the healthcare workers, the general public, and the hospitals in that state. And the thing that, Alicia, I've been thinking about is there is this thing in public health called, it's just a bias towards us. When we get a new threat, we want a normalcy bias. We want to pretend things are normal, and in most cases, most of us wise up when we see more data. But when you have situations such as a state where governors and politicians continue to undermine the threat, it kind of also misleads people who could be taking those steps to keep themselves safe. And that's as a physician, as a public health person, I can only wish that we can just turn that around and leave the politics behind. It's 18 months. It's been a long time. Many of us have died. Many of us have lost people. Let's just leave this behind. Let's just work to get to the other side safely.
Well, in contrast to your very well-reasoned argument there, I want to bring us over to Texas, where Governor Abbott is banning COVID vaccine mandates, regardless of FDA approval status. I mean, can the state move in the right direction without those mandates?
I think that the trouble is that the vaccines themselves have been politicized, right? If you were in a state where the vaccine hadn't been politicized, you could get an uptake of those vaccines and potentially get to a point where, with unfortunately the number of infections that they've had and the vaccines, you may get to a point where you could achieve that level of balance with the virus. Unfortunately, if you don't mandate those vaccines in many of those areas, you might see Texas, for example, has huge nursing home clusters. And the reason why is because at some point there's a study that showed 50% of nursing home workers are actually vaccinated. And so they're potentially bringing in the virus and passing it on to vulnerable residents. So mandates in those types of situations really is helping the vulnerable. But if you don't do that, the path, we know the only way to get to the other side is we get vaccinated, or unfortunately, we get the infection. And so the path open to Texans and others where you don't bring those vaccination rates up, unfortunately, is to get the infection. And I think most of us would say that's much more dangerous. It's going to end up with more people in the hospital, more people passing away, and more people with long COVID.
You flagged this tweet for us. I want to pull it up. It's from Andy Slavitt, who writes, I am hopeful that COVID is reaching a peak in southern states. The key to this is stopping the spread in schools, which is also a really good idea. Talk about why this is so critical.
Yeah, I think that, what I liked about Andy pointing this out is that, look, you've seen Delta move through this piece, finding people who are vulnerable, who don't have immunity towards this. And in some cases, people who've had the disease and unfortunately are getting this again because, with the Delta variant, we are seeing reinfections. Once you're getting to that point where in the current status quo, most of those people have been exposed. The new factor that's changing is colleges will open, more kids will go to school, and now that's what's going to change, right? And so in those settings, more vulnerable people may be exposed. And so protecting our children is one way to keep that peak from continuing to go up, because that's where the new cases are coming from. We've seen increases in pediatric cases. This is not news. We're seeing this with Delta, with this more transmissible disease. And so you don't want to if you don't want this peak to continue, one of the ways we do this is that when we change the equation and more of our kids are in school, when colleges are open, we need to make sure those gathering spaces of vulnerable people are also safe.
Dr. Bedelia, as always, thank you for spending some time with us today. The Gulf Coast is bracing for what could be a major hurricane barreling towards them late this weekend. The path and how people are preparing up next.
The time to prepare is now. We have a storm that will soon enter the Gulf. The Gulf is absolutely ripe in terms of the conditions for rapid intensification of this storm. Everybody in Louisiana along the coast needs to be prepared for a hurricane that could come as early as late Sunday, potentially on Monday, and it could be a major hurricane.
The governor of Louisiana declaring a state of emergency and warning of a major storm set to hit the Gulf Coast. Hurricane Ida is predicted to make landfall on Sunday, strengthening to a Category 3 or higher hurricane, 16 years to the day that Katrina made landfall in that state. Storm preparations and evacuations are underway for what will be the most powerful storm to hit the U.S. so far this year. Forecasters warn that Ida will pose a significant threat to New Orleans, which could see up to 11 feet of rain in some parts of the city, testing the flood walls and water pumps put in after Katrina. The National Weather Service warns that the overtopping of local levees is possible. Along with Louisiana, parts of Mississippi and Alabama are also under hurricane and storm watches. That's going to do it for me this hour. I will see you this weekend on American Voices. Nicole is back on Monday. The next hour of Deadline White House with my friend, Dr. Jason Johnson, starts right after this quick break.
Our hearts go out to all those who we've lost. But look, the mission there being performed is dangerous, and is now it's come with a significant loss of American personnel. And but it's a worthy mission because they continue to evacuate folks out of that region, out of the airport. Evacuated more than 12,000 additional people out of the airport in the last 24 hours. I met with my commanders this morning, first thing in the morning, got a detailed briefing about yesterday's attacks and the measures they're taking to protect our forces and complete the mission. And we will complete the mission.
Hi, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in the East. I'm Jason Johnson in for Nicole Wallace. Joe Biden today having to confront new challenges of his presidency as he recognizes yesterday's horrible attack in Kabul amid warnings that another is likely. As the president laid out many times, his motivation for ending America's involvement in Afghanistan was to prevent any more U.S. military deaths in America's longest war. But yesterday, 13 U.S. service members were killed and 18 injured from a suicide bombing at Kabul's airport. Over 100 Afghans died as well. Over the past 2 days, the commander-in-chief has voiced sympathy for the hero's loss and vowed retribution. The Washington Post reports on the significance of yesterday's attack for President Biden. Quote, the killings clearly marked a pivotal moment in Biden's presidency and an episode that is likely to be part of his legacy. Biden keeps a tally of U.S. service members who have died in Iraq and Afghanistan on a card in his breast pocket. And now, for the first time, that tally will include some who lost their lives on his watch. In addition to the strategic, security, and humanitarian challenges ahead for this administration, Michael Shear in the New York Times writes about the possible political consequences. Quote, America's tumultuous exit from Afghanistan has dragged down Mr. Biden's approval ratings, and the bombings on Thursday surely will open him up to political criticism. But it was unclear what the damage would be to his presidency in the long term, as he exits a war that most Americans want out of as well. Right now, the administration is navigating a surge of criticism from lawmakers, which heightened in the wake of yesterday's attack. Some Republicans have even gone so far as to say Biden should resign. But Eugene Robinson in the Washington Post poses a question, quote, how exactly did the Biden administration's critics think U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan was ever going to end? Robinson continues, quote, certainly not like this is not a valid answer. However tragic Thursday's attacks near the Kabul airport proved to be. Please be specific. Did you envision a formal ceremony at the U.S. Embassy with the American flag being lowered and the Taliban flag being raised?
Did you see the Taliban waiting patiently while the U.S.-trained Afghan army escorted U.S. citizens, other NATO nationals, and our Afghan collaborators to the airport for evacuation? Did you imagine that the country's branch of the Islamic State would watch peacefully from the sidelines? This is not an apologia for the tragic and chaotic scenes that have been unfolding in Kabul. Rather, it is a reality check. If there is a graceful, orderly way to abandon involvement in a brutal, unresolved civil war on the other side of the world, please cite historical precedents, because I can't find them. And that's where we begin this hour. Joining us now, retired Admiral James Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander at NATO and now MSNBC's Chief International Security and Diplomacy Analyst. Also with us, Jeremy Butler, a Navy veteran and CEO of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, and NBC News Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kuby. Courtney, I'll start with you. We're getting information. What are we hearing out of the Pentagon, out of the White House now about the possibility of further attacks? There are still people being evacuated from the country. We're still searching for people who need to be evacuated. What's the likelihood of another one of these attacks?
So the U.S. has credible and specific intelligence about another potential attack, very similar to the one we saw yesterday, Jason. So there are three main lines of concern that the U.S. is watching for. One is another suicide attack, just like what we saw yesterday at the Abbey Gate. And in this case, it's someone who straps explosives to him or herself and is able to walk near or even onto Hamid Karzai International Airport and detonate. Yesterday, not only was there the suicide attack, the reason that the military kept referring to it as a complex attack is because it involved more than one location or more than one, in this case, more than one means of attack. So after the suicide attack, there was also an ensuing gunfight. Another concern, though, is the reality or the possibility of a vehicle-borne explosive device. Now, this would be a vehicle that would be packed with explosives, and the real concern is that somebody would be able to drive it onto Hamid Karzai Airport and detonate. The third one is the threat from a rocket attack. Now, this could come in two forms. One would be that they would launch rockets, that they would land on the airfield, pock up the runway, and stop or slow the evacuation efforts. But a larger concern is that they would target a U.S. aircraft, particularly in this case, a charter aircraft, with evacuees, potentially injuring or killing hundreds of people on board. The U.S. military aircraft, of course, have some methods that they might be able to stop or deter that kind of an attack. But there's so many charter aircraft coming that's coming and going that's one of the real concerns here. And again, what's important to point out, we are now hearing from U.S. military officials that this is a specific line, a specific and credible threat, and it is continuing, Jason.
Goodness gracious. Look, we recently got the breakdown of the 13 service members killed in action yesterday, 11 Marines, 1 Navy corpsman, and 1 soldier. Are there any other details we're hearing either about the lives lost yesterday or any additional information about the attack that you can share with us today?
No, I mean, the one new thing that we found out today is that there was, rather than 2 explosions, there was one at the Abbey Gate. There was not a second one at the Barrett Hotel, which is right nearby. You can kind of chalk this up to the fog of war and the chaos that ensues after one of these attacks, that there's reports that end up, the first reports that come in end up generally have not always been completely right. So there was one explosion, but there was gunfire afterwards. We don't have a really good sense of what it was that killed so many of the civilians. Because remember, there were dozens of Afghan civilians injured and killed in this attack as well. We don't really know if it was the initial explosion or the ensuing gunfight that caused more of the people here, but we can tell you that there was a large loss of life. One of the big questions that we've been trying to find out is exactly how many were there so many U.S. military casualties here? Because it wasn't just the 13 who were killed. There were also at least 18 injured. That's a huge number of casualties at one location. And it may be that, again, it wasn't just the initial blast, but the gunfight that followed.
Thank you so much. NBC's Courtney Kuby, thank you so much for starting off our show today. I want to go straight to you, Admiral Stavridis. How can we protect our soldiers? How can we better protect our evacuees? This is going to be a difficult process regardless. And we don't want to get into a situation where we're sending more troops into Afghanistan to help people out. But what's the best way to keep these evacuations going smoothly and safely in the wake of what are likely going to be future attacks?
Number one, talk to the commanders on the ground. They're out walking the perimeter constantly. They're checking in with their troops. Get the people who are on the ground, ask them what they need. I assure you that is exactly what the Pentagon is doing now. And whatever the commanders need in terms of technology, or if they do need specialized assistance, all that can be provided even in these remaining few days. Secondly, distasteful, but you've got to continue to coordinate with the Taliban. The reality of this terrible situation is that we are hemmed in, and we have to depend on the Taliban for at least initial contact with all those who want to come in, and we want to continue that process right up till the very last minute. Thirdly, intelligence. I need to focus with our intelligence community. The eyes of the United States are on this zone right now. Every asset we have, satellites, drones, our manned networks, if you will, the CIA, all that intelligence has to flow in there. Those are kind of the three key stones. But all of it, I'm with Courtney here. There are so many different scenarios. We know the Islamic State tends to come in waves when they attack. I'm very concerned about somebody going after an aircraft, or perhaps even using a truck bomb from inside the airport, fuel trucks that move all around that airport, civilian side to the military side. It's going to be a very dicey few days. Let's all keep our troops and our evacuees in our thoughts and prayers.
Jeremy, I want to play you some sound from Congressman Seth Moulton on Morning Joe this morning, talking about some of the challenges of working with the Taliban, which the Admiral just referenced. And I want to get your thoughts about this sound on the other side.
What was that like for you to see, as a veteran of several tours, to see the United States relying on the Taliban and effectively working with the terrorist group?
I mean, it was the most bizarre thing I could ever imagine. And these Marines who grew up knowing that the Taliban harbored the people who attacked us on 9/11 were now asked to work with these terrorists. But we have to save lives. And one of the most important things we learned by being there on the ground is that crazy relationship with the Taliban is actually going to be really important going forward. Because no matter how, even if we extend the deadline to September 11th, the negotiated original date with the Taliban, we cannot possibly save all these people. There will be tens of thousands that we leave behind, and the only way to get them out in the future is if we have a productive relationship with the Taliban.
Jeremy, this is really interesting to me because I think what the congressman mentioned applies to both the Taliban and to Americans. The young people out there fighting right now, they were kids when 9/11 happened. They may have been born in 2003. You could be 18, 19 years old and have been born after this war. What is it like, or what are some of your thoughts with this idea that the United States, a whole new generation of people who have been in this forever war, are having to build relationships for this evacuation when their whole lives they've been told that the other side is the enemy?
No, it's as bizarre as Representative Moulton said, but it's also as important as both he and the Admiral just said. It's what is necessary to accomplish this mission. And we have been hearing, the veterans that I work with and that are members of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America and many other veterans groups, they have been furious for weeks. And it's not about our working with the Taliban. That may be some of it, but what the anger is coming from is the fact that the warnings have been there for so long that we have been saying this loudly and with the same voice that we have to have started earlier to get our allies out. That is really where the anger is going. I think the questions that Eugene Robinson raised in the Washington Post article that you mentioned in the beginning are absolutely correct and fair. But I think what it misses is that a lot of the anger right now is from the fact that much of this could have been avoided had the president, had this administration followed what so many of us were telling them, which was that you needed to start this evacuation of the special immigrant visa applicants months ago. They did what they needed to do in order to qualify for these visas a long time ago. It had nothing to do with the speed of the Taliban advance. It had nothing to do with when or how long it may have taken for the Afghan government to fall. They qualified in many cases years ago, if not decade ago. And if we had gotten them out then and been working on this for several years, the situation certainly could be better.
Jeremy, I'm glad you mentioned that because the last several weeks I've been talking to friends of mine who have been deployed in different generations. I got friends in my 40s, friends in their 30s, people who had been there on the ground fighting and saw some of these problems all along. With that in mind, do you think it's realistic for the U.S. government to keep this sort of August 31st deadline, or do we need to go back to the drawing board with the Taliban and say, hey, look, we're not going to be able to get all these people out by August 31st. Can you give us some more time and space? I mean, it seems to me that it's more important to get the job done than it is to get the job done on a particular date. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it was a lot easier to say, hey, let's stick it out for as long as it's necessary to get everyone out up until yesterday morning. That changed a lot. We all feared that an attack like this was coming, but it just shows how dangerous it is for every additional day that we're there. That said, it is also an imperative that we continue to do what we need to do to get our allies out. My opinion is that it's going to make the most sense to stick to the 31st deadline, but then also absolutely ensure that we have a plan in place, that we're communicating, and that we're doing everything possible so that we can continue to get allies out, continue to get Americans out long after the end of this operation, be it on the 31st or be it several days after.
Admiral Stavridis, the polling numbers show that the vast majority of Americans think that we should be doing all we can to help Afghan refugees, to help interpreters. I mean, the Republicans, the independents, is the only thing we seem to be able to agree on this country in the last 6 or 7 years. What needs to be done on this end, on the American side, to not only vet the refugees who come here, but make sure they can integrate their lives in the United States of America? You've got families. These are, I always want to break this stereotype. This is not every part of Afghanistan is a third world country. You got doctors, you got lawyers, you got school teachers. These people are trying to build new lives here. How are we going to make that process easier for them as they come to the United States?
Well, I'm really encouraged by what I've seen here, starting out with the poll numbers. And also, it's in our DNA. When people come from this kind of refugee situation, they come here to this country, so often they become game changers for our nation. We've seen that over and over again. Cuban American community, the Vietnamese American community. I think this Afghan community will be strong and very effective. And I'll tell you why. What they're going through is like the Hunger Games. I mean, how much determination and grit and endurance does it take to put your 2-year-old on your back, grab your 4-year-old's hand, take your wife or your husband, and make it through the gauntlet of KIA? I want that person on my team, not only because it's the right thing to do, but they are the kind of people who overcome obstacles, who have ingenuity, who are often strong leaders. So that's what I want us to accept is the importance of doing this. And I think we're off to a good start. You see the civilian communities all across the country rising up. You see great organizations like Jeremy's that are building sponsor kinds of programs. You see the U.S. military capable of taking tens of thousands of them onto bases and give them a springboard into American life. If we do that, it will be repaid to us many times over. We've seen that again and again.
Out of these thousands of people we're bringing here, there are future doctors, lawyers, teachers, husbands, wives, probably members of Congress. Admiral James Stavridis and Jeremy Butler, thank you both for starting us off on this hour. After the break, despite the flood of death threats and racist attacks from the far right, the officer who shot and killed a Capitol terrorist charging on the House chamber on January 6th is stepping out of hiding, speaking to NBC's Lester Holt. Plus, millions of Texans poised to lose critical voting rights and millions of renters poised to lose their homes. The new two-front fight that's opened up in America in just the last 24 hours. And the California recall election and why it's important enough that President Biden himself is planning to get involved. Deadline White House continues after a quick break, so don't go anywhere.
Our world is facing some big challenges. Chuck Todd breaks them down. A deep dive into a new topic.
Instead of covering all the big stories, we're going to cover one single subject impacting American politics.
Exploring and explaining the critical issues that affect our future. Meet the Press Reports. All episodes of Season 2 are now available on demand on Peacock.
Were you afraid that day?
I was very afraid.
Are you afraid now? Going forward?
I am afraid because I know there's people that disagree with my actions on January the 6th, but I hope they understand I did my job. And there was imminent threats and danger to the members of Congress.
That was Capitol Police Lieutenant Michael Byrd, the man who shot and killed terrorist Ashley Babbitt on January 6th, revealing himself publicly for the first time during an interview yesterday with NBC's Lester Holt. Byrd, a 28-year veteran of the Capitol Police Force, says he saved countless lives that day as he prevented rioters from reaching the House chamber, where he says he was protecting 60 to 80 House members and staff. Byrd has been in hiding since the insurrection after his name leaked on right-wing sites, resulting in racist remarks and death threats. Let's take a listen.
Can you give us the nature of some of those threats?
They talked about, killing me, cutting off my head, very vicious and cruel things.
Racist things?
There were some racist attacks as well. It's all disheartening because I know I was doing my job.
Given the nature of the threats that you describe, do you have any concern about showing your face and identifying yourself?
Of course I do. That is a very vital point, and it's something that is frightening. I believe I showed the utmost courage on January 6th, and it's time for me to do that now.
Joining our conversation is Dr. Christina Greer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University and a politics editor at The Griot, and Frank Figliuzzi, former FBI Assistant Director for Counterintelligence, NCE, host of the Bureau podcast, and an Embassy National Security Analyst. Dr. Greer, I'm going to start with you. There's a piece that I wrote several months ago talking about Eugene Goodman. He was the African-American officer who basically saved Mitt Romney's life by taunting terrorists and leading them away from the chamber. Now we've got Officer Byrd coming forward, talking about the danger that he was in and how he had to shoot Ashley Babbitt. I want you to talk a little bit about what is the significance of two of the most known heroes of this insurrection on January 6th being black men, and the unique dangers that they face in standing up to these groups that may not be the same for some of the white officers who are also defending Congress.
Right. Thank you, Jason. I mean, full stop, we know that January 6th had racist undertones and overtones. The president of the United States at the time ginned up his base to then go and overthrow the Capitol. And we saw the swastikas there. We saw the Confederate flags. We know that many of those people, if not the vast majority of those people, believe that America should be for a certain type of white individual, not for immigrants and definitely not for people of color and people of African descent. And so when we think about how black people have defended this country, not just on January 6th, but from the beginning of our history, when we think about all the wars we've had, when we think about police officers who've been killed by their colleagues, black police officers, when we think about black officers returning from World Wars I and II and being lynched in their uniforms, we know that there is a disconnect with how this country sees black law enforcement and black police officers and black military personnel, male and female, and the level of respect that they've failed to receive over decades. And so when we think about officers Robinson and sort of all the other extra black officers that day, they had a dual job that day. It was not just to protect the American people and protect the Capitol, but also to try and protect themselves. We can see from the horrific footage, the people who stormed the Capitol were out for blood, not just for Mitt Romney and Vice President Pence, but definitely African Americans. And to do that in Washington, D.C., a majority black city, says a lot. And so these two black officers who risked their lives literally to save American democracy should not go into the dustbin of history. And until we actually face the facts, the real facts of what happened on January 6th and the racist undertones and overtones, we can't move forward as a nation. And so many Republican elected officials should be ashamed of themselves for trying to make it seem as though it was just a little bit of a parade that got a teeny bit unruly. That is absolutely not what it was. It cannot go into the history books as such.
Eugene Goodman, Michael Byrd, these are African Americans who put their lives on the line to keep this country safe and yet still can't seem to get protection for the right to vote. Frank Figliuzzi, I want to bring up an interesting sort of part of that conversation. It's a tear from NBC. Officer Byrd talked about the fact that he did not know if Ashley Babbitt was armed or not. but he still felt like he needed to do his job. Now, look, I'm not an expert. I'm not an officer, not the FBI, so I'm deferring to you on this. But to me, if you're that far in the building at that point, you are a threat. And it seemed reasonable to me that he could use whatever force was available. But, from a security standpoint and a safety standpoint, was he justified in using lethal force, even if he didn't know that Ashley Babbitt was armed?
Well, we don't have to take your layman's opinion on this. We can look toward the 3 separate investigations that have been done, including Department of Justice civil rights investigation, including U.S. Capitol Police internal affairs investigation. And all of these investigations have found that he was well within the deadly force policy. What do most deadly force policies for police departments say? An officer needs to be in reasonable fear of imminent death or serious bodily harm to himself or others. That, in my opinion, and I have led during a portion of my career as chief inspector in the FBI, I led all use of force shooting inquiries within the FBI. I would have come to this same conclusion. Now, I'm going to tell you something. I'm monitoring law enforcement forums where law enforcement hang out, even law enforcement executives. And here's what I'm saying and hearing in terms of this. They're saying in any other police department, this officer would have been fired or found to be outside the scope of the policy for deadly force. And then here's the problem. When someone comes back and says to them, have you seen all of the video from inside that building? Have you listened to the radio traffic that Lieutenant Byrd was hearing then with regard to officers down, officers assaulted, people wanting to kill Nancy Pelosi, the screams that he was hearing from the other side of that door coming at him? He was that thin blue line that day. And when that window in that door crashed and he had 60 to 80 Congress members and staff behind him, he was that guy between the murderous crowd and those protectees. When you ask them that question, you often get the answer, well, I haven't listened to all of that. So, if you think it's an unreasonable use of force, it's probably because you're ignoring the available facts, the radio traffic and the testimony of police from inside that building. And the other aspect to this that I'm seeing on forums, particularly extremist forums, is the racial aspect of this. Many, many commentators there saying, if this was a white officer who shot a Black Lives Matter protester, he would be arrested. And of course, this is not an equal, this is apples and oranges. The facts aren't the same there, right? And so there is no other police department like the Capitol Police who protect literally our democratic process. He was within his policy. He did do the right thing. And his coming out to speak about it, I view as a second act of heroism for Lieutenant Byrd.
Yeah, I mean, given the fact that Botham Jean is a black man who can get shot in his home, Atiana Jefferson could be shot in her home playing video games, it seems pretty clear to me that black people can be shot regardless of what they happen to be doing. But Frank, I also think there's something key about this. Given the large number of people who were part of that insurrection, who were also either former or current law enforcement or military people, talk about how that creates an increased danger for somebody like Officer Byrd coming forward, because the people who are coming after him aren't just your angry people on the streets. Some of these people might be trained officers. They actually know how to track somebody down and harm them.
There's no question that there is chatter right now as we speak about bringing harm to Lieutenant Byrd, people calling him the most vile names, people trying to figure out where he is. He is a hero, not a target. And I have to assume and hope that he has taken precautions for his own security, his family's security. But he's doing the right thing. It's a funny thing about truth and facts. They're like sunshine. You can only block them out for so long. They want to shine. And he needs to get this truth out so people can hear it.
Dr. Greer, Frank has mentioned several times that he's paying attention to the chatter online, the communication. The January 6th committee has subpoenaed a lot of logs from social media. They're going after 4chan and 8kun and Facebook and Gab and Google. I'm pretty sure Tinder and Grindr are on there somewhere. Clearly these are places where people were connecting in order to prepare, discuss, and justify their behavior. What do you think the January 6th Commission could get out of this? I mean, some of it's obviously going to be a lot of people talking, but from a political standpoint, an investigative standpoint, what do you think they might be able to get off of Google or some chat line about the January 6th insurrectionists?
Well, Jason, we know that many people, on these dating apps have actually been able to assist the FBI because so many of these men who stormed the Capitol are bragging about it when they're trying to get a date. I think the January 6th Commission needs to do several things. One, and this is a priority for me, find out actually how many Republican members of Congress actually knew that this was happening and whether or not they were communicating with people who were inside the Capitol. I think that actually is something that we must get to the bottom of. And in addition to not just the law enforcement officers who were there, I'm actually concerned with the number of educators who were in that crowd as well. I mean, these are people who are with our children day in and day out, and they're willing to threaten not just the lives of Capitol police officers, but our democracy writ large. I'm also hoping that the January 6th Commission can make sure that, I don't know if Republicans could hear that this is an American issue that we need to get to the bottom of. It absolutely should not be partisan. It should not be seen as a Democratic witch hunt. We should really care about what happened for the future of this Democratic Republic.
If you're a terrorist on a dating app, you want to be out here. You don't really want to be out here. You think you want to be out here in a dating app, but you don't. Dr. Christina Greer and Frank Figluzzi, thank you so much for your time today on Deadline White House. Coming up, the twin crises that erupted overnight, the GOP assault on democracy in Texas, and the threat to millions of Americans struggling to make ends meet as we surpass 18 months of the coronavirus pandemic.
Courts have pointed out over and over and over again intentional discrimination against African Americans, intentional discrimination against Latinos, intentional discrimination against people of color. These are not my words. These are 3 federal courts across this country making 10 findings of that intentional discrimination.
Intentional discrimination against people of a certain race, is that racism?
That is...
Ms. Hinojosa.
Those words, intentional discrimination, I think can be fairly characterized in that manner.
We can talk about racial impacts of this legislation without accusing members of this body of being racist.
Can you, though? I don't really think so. Because brutal and, yes, racist voter suppression laws like the one getting final passage out of the Texas House this afternoon sure don't seem like they're actually designed to stop widespread voter fraud. Consider the fact that Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton's office spent 22,000 hours looking for voter fraud in 2020 and uncovered just 16 cases of false addresses on registration forms, according to the Houston Chronicle. Nearly 17 million voters are registered in Texas. And seemingly adjacent to that news from Texas yesterday, another development, equally out of touch with reality. The Supreme Court pulled the rug out from under renters, blocking the CDC from enforcing President Biden's federal moratorium on evictions. From the New York Times, quote, the decision puts hundreds of thousands of tenants at risk of losing shelter while the administration struggles to speed the flow of billions of dollars in federal funding to people who are behind in rent because of the coronavirus pandemic and its associated economic hardship. Joining us now is Julian Castro, former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and former Mayor of San Antonio. He's now the host of the Our America podcast. And Elie Mystal, Justice Correspondent for The Nation, is also here. Secretary Castro, I'm going to start with this. We talked about this several weeks ago on my podcast on Slate. This eviction moratorium is such an absolute mess. One, there's billions of dollars in money made available to help people stay in their homes that has not yet been properly distributed. And worse, even if there is another stopgap created by Nancy Pelosi in the House, you still run into the situation of hundreds of thousands of people having an eviction on their record, which will make it more expensive for them to get another place to live. How did we get here? And what are the options right now to protect hundreds of thousands of people while we're in a raging pandemic from being thrown out in the street or into a hospital?
Yeah, it's a big fail, Jason, on so many different levels. The failure of the court, as Justice Breyer pointed out in his dissent, this is an issue that the court has not adjudicated on, not opined on exactly before. And so they should have taken time to actually hear the oral arguments and make a final decision after that. They didn't do that. And because of that, as you say, potentially hundreds of thousands of people in this country or more may be kicked out summarily because there's no protection anymore. It was a fail on the part of state and local governments not getting that aid out to needy tenants and landlords. only about 10% of those billions of dollars, $47 billion, has actually reached the hands of people that need it. This was even after the administration pushed them to streamline their bureaucratic processes to make it easier for that money to get out there and gave them more time. You remember on August 3rd, they refashioned this eviction moratorium from the CDC to buy a little bit of time. That hasn't seemed to really jumpstart the process. So it's a big fail. And what should happen now is that Congress should take it up, but also states that don't have an eviction moratorium in place should push to get one in place. Localities that have the authority under the state charter or state constitution to create their own should do that right now.
Ellie, so we had audio of the Texas Speaker of the House saying, hey, I'm sick and tired of you guys talking about this ocean and always having to say wet. He didn't want anybody to talk about racism as they are trying to pass a racist law to suppress the vote. But I want to connect this also to our administration. Earlier this year, President Joe Biden said that these attacks on voting rights for black people are the biggest threat that this country has faced since the Civil War, and yet he doesn't appear to have done much. Most of the answers that we get from the administration boil down to, I really think you black people can just organize a bit harder. It's time for you to make your own bricks. From a legal standpoint, what should be happening at the Department of Justice about these kinds of laws that we've first seen in Georgia? Now we see a worse version in Texas, and soon we'll see it in other states as we're heading into the midterms.
Yeah, Texas Democrats have shown us what men of will truly will do when they're faced with horrible laws. The laws in Texas are racist. We know that because they have a racially disparate effect. The thing that's supposed to happen in that situation is that the Justice Department is supposed to sue the states for their racism, which is a violation of the Voting Rights Act and, more importantly, the 15th Amendment. And then we're supposed to have courts that uphold the 15th Amendment. But we don't really have that, do we? And that's where it ties in to your first story here. Democrats have to stop acting like Peter Quill, punching Thanos awake and then being surprised when they get snapped, all right? The court is out to lunch. The court is in YOLO mode. They are no longer bound by constitutional strictures. They don't care about the 15th Amendment. They don't care about the Voting Rights Act. They don't care about the separation of powers. They're doing this all on the shadow docket. Remember, people, the court isn't even in session right now. They don't come back until October. They did this for fun, to kick people out onto the streets. And at some point, Democrats have to do something. As Representative Castro well knows, there is a bill in Congress right now supported by Mondaire Jones that calls for expanding the number of justices on the Supreme Court from 9 to 12. That's what has to happen next, because this Supreme Court has proven consistently that they do not care about precedent. They do not care about voting rights. They do not care about the 15th Amendment. Somebody has to stop them.
Secretary Castro, I'm thinking back to yesterday when President Biden was answering questions about Afghanistan. He just kind of lowers his head, right? We're seeing with Afghanistan that President Biden, when there's something he believes in, he'll take the heat. He'll take it from Democrats. He'll take it from Republicans. He'll take it from the outside when it's something he believes in. I want to show you this tweet by Sarah Kinzador, who's one of my favorite writers and tweeters and political analysts right now. This is a list of things that Joe Biden hasn't handled. This is a list of things that President Biden hasn't addressed that are fundamental to protecting our democracy. He has not been as aggressive on voting rights as he has been about Afghanistan. He has not been as aggressive about hunting down former members of the Trump administration as he's been on other issues. He has not been as aggressive on the eviction moratorium. As a Democrat and as someone who served in an administration, what do you need to tell your party right now or this administration about how dire our circumstances are? Because we're no longer at halftime. We're at the end of the fourth quarter and we're down 20 points.
Well, yeah, especially on this issue of voting rights. Those are so fundamental. I mean, not only are you talking about people's access to the ballot box, you're talking about, if you want to put it in terms that politicians will understand, their survival in office. You're not going to have a Democratic majority in the House or the Senate come January of 2023 if these Republicans are allowed to continue to rig elections toward their own favor. Manchin, Sinema, and of course, the president need to understand the urgency of that. And it's all about priorities. I don't doubt that President Biden agrees with a lot of the positions that Democrats have taken, even many of the progressive Democrats, and that he has a good heart. But it's, where are your priorities? You're willing to go on to the mat on issues A, B, and C, but on D, E, and F, you're not. And what he risks, if he doesn't address voting rights, if he doesn't address other issues like immigration in a bold, positive way, is that you're going to shatter that Democratic coalition. And also, maybe more importantly, you're shortchanging the quality of life and the life outcomes of many people in this country.
And I want to point out, hundreds of thousands of people being out of their homes doesn't just exacerbate the pandemic, but people without houses have a lot of trouble voting as well. Julian Castro and Ellie Mistal, thank you both for spending some time with us today. Coming up, the California recall election and its potential implication for every single Democrat across the country. That's next. Don't turn that channel. Deadline White House is coming back.
Hey, it's Chris Hayes. This week on my podcast, Why Is This Happening? I'll be talking with the legendary Grammy Award-winning musician, Ani DeFranco.
Even when you're not in your zone, when you're struggling with something, but if you're totally open, if you accept that struggle, like if you can show it and you can include the audience in what you're struggling against and your own process of when I'm on stage and it's pouring rain and the wind is whipping, my hair is down my throat and the sound is terrible and I'm being electrocuted. If I'm just in that thing and sharing it fully with the audience, they could get off on even that.
That's this week on Why Is This Happening? Search for Why Is This Happening wherever you're listening right now and subscribe.
The election to recall California Governor Gavin Newsom is heating up. The White House announcing that President Biden would be making a trip to campaign for the embattled governor. While Newsom's polling has improved recently, just over 50% of Californians say they would vote to keep him, according to 538. And the pressure is on for Biden and other Democrats to help Newsom stave off his challenge, as officials from both parties will prepare to pounce on the results as a sign of what we can expect from next year's midterm elections. Joining us now is Cristiana Rana, Policy Director of the Latino Community Foundation, and Dr. Niambi Carter, Associate Professor of Political Science at Howard University. Cristiana, I'll start with you. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. When I'm in Southern California, I see commercials with Elizabeth Warren all the time telling people, hey, make sure that you vote against the recall. As somebody on the ground, and in particular connected to the Latino community and brown community, are people really paying attention to this recall? Because clearly the far right is ginned up about it. But is the rest of the state prepared for the consequences of if they're not excited about this and don't go out and vote?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Latino voters are paying attention to this election. The question is, who's paying attention to us? Right now, we see organizations like the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights. Their organizers are going door to door, talking to their neighbors, talking about the implications of if Governor Newsom does get recalled. We see 16, 17, 18-year-old kids in California's Central Valley making the case to their peers that they're tired of drinking polluted water and breathing dirty air. This is a fight for their lives. The question is, do the candidates and the campaigns, are they talking to them about the issues that they are caring about?
Dr. Carter, you and I have studied this. Recall elections can be complicated, and I've seen the California ballot. It's not easy. First, it asks you, are you in favor of the recall or not in favor of the recall? But if you're not sure about the recall, here are your other options. It's more confusing than going into a McDonald's and you don't know the menu. What do you think could be the possibility that the ballot itself, or just the structure of California's recall elections, ends up giving us a result that's not really reflective of how people feel on the ground in the state?
Well, you put that nail on the head there, Jason, because people see this question and feel like they have to answer both parts, when really you only have to answer the first part. Do you want to recall or no? And you can stop there. I think when people see the other option, they get confused and say, well, I don't really like Gavin Newsom, and I'm not sure about these candidates, so let me just pick somebody. And that happens. Or people aren't very clear about the rules and think that if they don't answer all the questions, right, the first part of the question and the second part, then their ballot may not be counted. So this is where it's really important for state actors to explain to people what this actually means and what that first part of that question really is going to get them to. Because what people may not understand is if I say yes to the first part of the question, then even if I don't pick somebody on the second part, one of these people could become the governor with, say, 20% of the vote of the state of California, even less. And I think that's a scary proposition most people don't want to happen, but may not be very clear given the wording of the ballot.
And Christian, speaking of one of those people who might slip into office with only 20-something% of the vote, we've got Larry Elder. Now, Larry Elder is a talk show host and a vehement misogynist. He has been a grotesque liar, first saying that Joe Biden was legitimately elected and then backtracking on that. There's investigations on him right now about waving a gun against a former significant other. You know, is the fear of, look, 15 years ago, it was Arnold Schwarzenegger. I understand why people thought that was interesting to have him in office. But is the fear of somebody grotesquely incompetent like Larry Elder getting into office the kind of thing that also is galvanizing folks on the ground to say, all right, as much problems as I might have with Gavin Newsom, I don't want Larry Elder to be my governor?
Right. I mean, Larry Elder has proudly been campaigning across the state, promoting this very anti-immigrant, anti-Latino agenda. What I would remind Larry Elder is that while that may win you some votes, it probably won't win you elections. We saw in California 30 years ago under former Governor Pete Wilson, who was promoting Proposition 187 that sought to ban healthcare and education for undocumented immigrants. In response to that, Latino communities, Black communities, Asian communities came together to fight against that hate. And that's the reason why we see the progressive California that we see today. So I would remind him and everyone else really running in this recall election that you may win a couple of votes here or there, but it will probably not win you this recall election. And until the day the Republican Party learns that, they'll never win the majority of the Latino vote.
Dr. Carter, again, looking at California, we've got Joe Biden coming. I've mentioned that I see commercials with Elizabeth Warren. You may have other prominent Democrats show up in the state. Is it a bad sign for Democrats in California that you have to have national figures showing up to campaign for an incumbent governor? Or is it just a reflection of a kind of broken system in California where a group of rich alt-right people can create these kinds of recalls, even if they're not reflective of the public sentiment?
I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. I think given the fact that California is such a deep blue state and such an important state nationally, it makes sense that Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris would be showing up there because this is really consequential for them because they're thinking about 2022 and what this is going to mean moving forward. It is also the case that the rules are very lax around recalls. And given the razor thin margins in a state like California, I don't think you want to leave anything to chance. Now, will it change California's mind? Probably not. But maybe some of those undecided voters who may not be certain about Gavin Newsom, but trust in Elizabeth Warren or trust in Kamala Harris, that could be a signal sender for them and help them decide their choice.
Christiana Rana and Niambi Carter, thank you so much for spending some time with us today on Deadline. We'll be right back after a quick break. It's an exciting yet overwhelmingly nervous time for parents and faculty across the country. Sending kids back to school while many of them remain vulnerable to the coronavirus. Families in the Northeast and upper Midwest might be getting a glimpse into their future, courtesy of what's happening down south. The AP reports, quote, more than 80 school districts or charter networks have closed or delayed in-person classes for at least one entire school in more than a dozen states. Others have sent home whole grade levels or asked half their students to stay home on hybrid schedules. At the college level, faculty at Spelman College have pushed back against in-person classes until the school provided stronger safety measures. And all across the country, schools from the University of Virginia to my alma mater, the University of Virginia, have either imposed vaccination requirements to attend or kicked out students who refuse. The truth is, while the financial incentive to get kids back in school is strong, so is the need to keep faculty and staff safe. And too many colleges and public schools aren't willing to take the steps to make hybrid or virtual classes viable. Everyone wants to act like everything is okay, but the Delta variant says otherwise. It's a gaslighting of American educators when lives are on the line. That does it for us this hour. Nicole will be back on Monday.
In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, hundreds of people recorded their stories.
The building was bleeding into the sky.
I cried out to Jesus and I asked him to just help me.
20 years later, these same voices return.
Time doesn't heal, it doesn't fix things, but time makes the trauma less sharp.
Memory Box, Echoes of 9/11, a feature documentary. Wednesday, September 8th at 10 p.m. Eastern on MSNBC and streaming exclusively on Peacock.